Jayden, how you doing, man?
I'm doing good, Eric. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for being here.
Absolutely. Appreciate you having me on.
Oh, anytime. Anytime you want to be on, just let me know. We'll
All
have you.
right.
Knowledge is something that I never run away from.
I agree. I'm the same way. Yeah, I'm always a student. I'm always learning something.
Exactly. So,
Yeah.
you're a ballistician at Hornady Manufacturing Company,
hmm
and you guys have a podcast, which is one that I've had forwarded to me a million times. And
Oh boy.
so I have, on my YouTube channel, I show what we do or what I do, right? My
hmm
process, and I also have a website where I teach reloading, and I've been doing that for a very long time.
hmm
And obviously, I have a process, just like
Yep.
I think everybody at some point that does something long enough, they have a process that say this is what I do.
Uh-huh.
Um, they can vary drastically, but as long as you arrive at the same conclusion or the same result, there's nothing wrong with it.
hmm
As a competitive shooter, we do kind of like what you guys were calling uh, the funnel. What were you guys
Yeah,
calling it?
the confirmation funnel. Yeah.
Confirmation funnel, where we
Confirmation
start with a
bias funnel.
broad range of components and powder charges and primers and cases and cartridges, right? And then we select the cartridge, and once we select the cartridge, then we select brass. I'm gonna shoot whoever,
Right.
right? And that changes things because they vary in case capacity. So you
A whole
select
bunch of ways. Yeah.
they select a brass manufacturer for whatever you needs or availability, whatever,
hmm
and then you select bullet, primer, powder,
hmm
and powder charge and bullet weight and whatever it is that it is going to fit your needs or our needs. And so yeah, it starts pretty broad, and then we start, and
Yeah, absolutely.
what we're looking for at the end is small groups.
hmm
Me as a competitive shooter, that's what I'm looking for, and I'm looking for small groups at 1,000 yards, and I shoot F class, which means 20 shot groups.
Yep.
However, we can't. At least I don't do 20 shot groups for testing. It's
hmm
just the other thing that we have is we have a limited barrel life, right? The more
Yes.
so everything has a limit. So anyway, on your podcast, you guys were discussing that pretty much small sampling is, for lack of better words, kind of pointless to do.
It can be. Yes.
Okay. So let's talk about that, because
Okay.
obviously everybody that was forwarding that email to me was, or that podcast that you guys did, and if you guys haven't seen it, go check it out. It's over at Hornady Podcast. It's very interesting conversation. You guys did too, because apparently you guys were also getting a lot of questions and a lot of
We were. Yeah. Yeah. We thought we'd do a follow-up to try to address some of those. I think we did. There's been even more questions since then. So hopefully, some of those can get answered in this one. That would be good.
yeah. So obviously the people were sending me this were saying, well, these guys obviously don't know what they're doing. These guys obviously don't, whatever, because you guys disagree with what we do as competitive
Mhm.
shooters. And as competitive shooters, we know everything.
Oh, of course. Yes. Yes. Yeah.
So, I joke, but, we have a system and it works. So
hmm
why deviate, right? Why burn up extra barrel life? Why the extra components? Why the extra time? Why all of that? Because ultimately, we still end up with really good results.
hmm
So let's talk about that. First, maybe you need to give a little background as to the discussion that you guys had on your podcast
Sure.
for those
Yeah, I
that
think
haven't
that'd be
seen
good.
it. Kind of cover the main points, and then we can kind of jump into the discussion.
Sounds great. Yeah. So why did we essentially what we did on the first podcast is we discussed a bunch of data that we had gathered. We entered in that podcast and essentially said, hey, we're not here to tell you what to do or that you're wrong or that you're right. We're going to tell you here's a bunch of data we gathered and here's what happened. And you can form your own opinions of that on what's right for you, because that's where the decision needs to be made. What's right for one discipline of shooting, or, just one hunter, whatever it may be. is not going to be the same for everybody. There's not one right answer to the case of your barrel life thing, right? Like a small sample size is not as statistically significant as a large sample size in predicting what's going to happen in the future. I think that's a universally accepted realm in the scientific world and the statistical world. And shooting is no different. We're still subject to those rules. They follow them. However, if your barrel life is very, very short, there's a very high cost to you shooting those large sample size tests before you ever use competition. So we understood those trade-offs and we discussed those in the podcast. I thought they came off pretty well. Maybe they didn't to some people, maybe they didn't hear it that way. But anyway, why did we do this testing in the first place? So this concept of the risk of small sample sizes and it telling you an accurate story about what's going to happen on a larger sample size or what's going to happen in the future as you continue to shoot, that's nothing new. I had read a really interesting article about a paper that was published in a scientific journal in 1971 that was discussing this issue. So this is nothing new. But the reason that we did it specifically is in the last decade or two, we've seen a increase in the, call it high volume, long range shooting disciplines, right? You're in F class. I would consider that a high volume discipline. You're shooting 20 shotters, right? For record. And then in the field style matches that we've seen grow in huge popularity over especially the last decade. So that would be the Precision Rifle Series, National Rifle League, those sorts of field style shooting matches. You're shooting high volumes. I mean, typically at one of those matches, you're going to shoot 200 rounds in a weekend, if not more. And so what we started to question was most of the legacy methods to say do load development or assess how good a system was, a rifle and ammunition combination, was based on pretty small sample size stuff, maybe 3-shot groups, 5-shot groups, 10-shot groups. And so what we said was the question that we had was how representative of that is my next 200 that I'm going to fire? Because that's what's going to happen at the match. I lay down to develop a load or check a load, and I shoot, say, a 10-shot group to do that. And that 10-shot group measures whatever size. How representative is that one recorded result I have to what's going to happen when I do 20 times that and I shoot 200 rounds over the weekend? That was the question we were looking into. Now, these scientific principles and statistical principles have applied for a long time, well before we did this study, like I said. So what we wanted to do is say, yeah, we know these things already exist, they're pre-established, but we have the ability here to just gather the data. Let's just do the test and see what comes out of it. And that's what that podcast was made up of. Now, during that podcast, we also discussed what may the implications be of that information. And the goal there was to try to paint a picture that if you do small sample sizes, you run the risk of, in the future, the performance not being the same as those small sample sizes. And I think that's the case with anything. If you take a small sampling or a polling, that's what you're doing with your rifle when you're testing a load, is you're sampling it, you're polling it to see how good it performs. Anytime you do that on a small sample size basis, that's not necessarily going to be representative of what happens in the future. Now, sometimes it can be, right? You can shoot a 3-shot group that is representative of what your next 200 rounds are going to do. And that happens, that works. But the inverse is also true. You can, and we see this all the time when somebody does a small sample size test, by nature of that, your chances of getting a better result are higher because of the small sample of the large. You don't have the chance of gathering an outlier or those fringes of the bell curve, the distribution that you hear about. So just by nature of doing a small sample size test, your results are going to be more precise. And to your perspective of that test itself, right, of the group size itself is going to be smaller. So that's going to give you an idea that your capability is better than what it actually might be when you shoot the next 200 rounds. Because when we shoot a match, we're not re-zeroing every single stage, say at these field style shooting matches. I know F-class and bench rest and stuff's a little bit of a different discipline, but if you're aiming at a target without making any adjustments to your zero, you can compensate for external ballistic needs, bullet drop, wind deflection, spin drift, all those things, of course. But you're still aiming at a target and shooting that target, and you're doing that over and over and over and over and over. If you were to take all of those and compile them together, you would have a 200-shot group, because technically you didn't change the way you did it. You aimed at a target, you shot the target. You didn't shoot the target, make an adjustment to your zero, and continue shooting. So the purpose of that whole thing was, how representative is these small samples that we've all grown up with and the methods that are established that you follow? How good do those predict what it's going to do in the future? And the result of that, as you saw on that podcast, was it really depends. It could be it could be representative, it could be wildly unrepresentative. And the risk there is that your system is actually worse than what your 3-shotter showed, because then as you continue to shoot and things get worse, you expect them not to. You expect that 3 or 5 shot group is representative of what's going to happen every single time in the future. When that doesn't happen, there's an issue. You have a problem to deal with. And what do you do about that problem? Well, a lot of people will just pick some unassociated value as the problem without any data to back up that is the issue. So this is commonly the discussion of the flyer, which I won't divulge from answering your first question here. But that was the reason that we put that information out and did that study, was how representative are these methods that we've been using predicting what happens when we continue to shoot.
Okay. That makes sense. However, yes, I agree. A group is never going to get smaller the longer you shoot. It's unless you're allowed to cherry pick, which online is apparently is allowed to do.
Yeah.
No, but seriously, it's never going to get smaller. So, I make barrel tuners, and on my tuners, I gave the instructions as pick a number, shoot 2 shots, look at them. If they widely apart, don't even bother. Change the tune, right? Because it's not going to get any better. Like,
correct. Yeah. A bad group is
this
proven bad. It's not going to get any better. Right.
And some people say, well, that's not statistically meaningful. It is right. when they're that far apart. Like it's not going to get smaller. It's already,
right. And
especially when we're doing a first, I guess first sweep through the settings to see what starts to trend smaller, right? But I guess I'm gonna push back a little bit on that, and maybe this is where we might agree, but it's in how it's my perception. One of the things you guys said was that quarter MOA guns, you guys have never seen one, and benchers guys do it every weekend, like literally all day long, all week long, and this is possibly where things started to kind of go. I was with you guys until you guys started making some of these claims, and they kind of just went right, because I'm like, how do you guys not know this? And I don't know if it was just again, this is why I wanted to talk to you directly, because I'm like, okay, sure, this is what I'm seeing, and let me just ask these questions directly. So, have you guys not ever seen a quarter MOA gun, honestly?
Well, what do you mean by quarter MOA gun? For how many shots?
150.
No, I have not seen a quarter MOA gun for 150 shots.
So this is where people would so okay, let me tell you where I didn't see it, but Bart Souter was on my podcast, and he won the 3-gun aggregate. So he had 3 different guns. So it wasn't one gun 150, it was 3 different guns, 4 or 5 different days, 100 and 200, and he shot 30 different groups, and his average aggregate was quarter MOA, 0.250, which
that's
is
an average.
Correct. And this is what I'm saying. It's like, what is the difference? Apparently, like the minute you said, well, that's an average. Okay. What does that mean to you? Or maybe this is where I need some clarification.
Okay, sure. So would 100% agree. If the statement was, this is an average quarter-minute gun, I can definitely agree with that. I've seen average quarter-minute guns. However, I've seen that gun that averages a quarter minute also produce a half-minute group within that average. The biggest group that gun produced was a half minute.
Well, if
although its average was a quarter, and its smallest one were down in the single holders, right? The sub 10th inch group sizes. What we were saying in that podcast is that variance exists. So we can call that a half minute or a quarter minute gun. There's no problem with that. However, we need to define what we're talking about. A quarter minute gun is a blanket statement.
Mm-hmm.
When you say it's a quarter minute gun, it averages a quarter minute, that's a different story. And that is an accurate story based on the data that you just said.
How would you define a quarter minute gun if not the average?
You have to define for how many shots and how often. Okay. Those two questions are critical. And we said that in that podcast, that when somebody makes a claim about a gun, it does this. You have to say, well, for how many shots, how often? Because that tells you the information you need to know. Because I don't know, are you telling me it can shoot a quarter minute group once, or it shoots 150 shots within a quarter minute? Those are two totally different capabilities. And so we have to ask those two follow-on questions to start to understand what we're telling each other.
Okay, so let me ask the question a different way. So, for example, let's say I have a gun, and for the life of the barrel, I'm talking 1,000 rounds.
Okay.
It averaged a quarter MOA.
Okay.
What would you call that gun?
An average quarter MOA gun.
Well, what's the difference between an average and a quarter MOA gun?
Well, what's the biggest group that gun ever shot? If it averaged a quarter minute, it had to have shot a group.
I get what average means, but what I don't get is what you mean when you say that's not a true quarter minute gun. So how would you define your quarter minute gun that you guys are referring to?
You have to answer those two additional questions.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
You can say it's a quarter minute average. That's fine. If you want to make a blanket statement, you have to encompass the worst result possible. Mm-hmm. So if I want to say that that's a quarter minute gun, but in reality, it produced a half minute group, the worst group it ever produced was a half minute. Mm-hmm. Can I say it's a quarter minute gun? It produced a half minute result. That's not true.
Okay. So how would you label that gun? I guess it's probably the better question.
With those follow-on questions, it's a quarter minute gun on average. Over how many shots? 150.
Well, I just said 1,000.
That third
in our
question,
example, it's 1,000. So 1,000, okay. And it shot an average
sample size.
What?
Yeah, that's a good sample size, right? So there's a difference when you tell me this is a quarter minute average gun, and I say for how many shots, and you're like over 1,000, versus you say 3. I did 1 3-shot group.
I get the difference. I absolutely see the difference. Yeah. But this is, again, I'm still not sure, because you know when I say quarter minute, you go average. You throw the average, which is I'm okay with. So I don't know how to. Again, we are competitive shooters, right? Mm-hmm. We see things differently. Obviously, not you and I. I mean, like competitive shooters from the rest of the shooters, right?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, the different disciplines, all and
even in
the
as different disciplines see things different ways. So I'm only speaking from my point of view, right?
Sure.
And I'm trying to understand yours, because when I heard that podcast, I've talked to many, because I was getting ready for this interview, and I've asked multiple of my shooting buddies, hey, take a look at this podcast. Let me know what you think. And they say things like, well, I made it 5 minutes in and I just turned it off. Couldn't hear couldn't listen anymore. I said, well, you have to keep an open mind. He said, oh,
sure,
those guys absolutely don't know anything about precision shooting. I said, well, they're not precision shooters, but what they are saying, so the point.
I would disagree there. We are precision shooters. We participate in many of the disciplines.
Which ones?
PRS, NRL. I personally haven't done bench rest or F class.
Well, those are not on the team. That was kind of the point. F class and bench rest do not consider PRS a precision game, because you have right, and again, this all goes into the definition of everything, right?
Sure, and we need to be precise in the words we use to understand each other.
So that's what I'm saying. So you guys, by our definition, are not precision shooters, because
what would your definition of precision shooting be or not be?
Well, the definition of a precision, not a precision shooter, but a precision discipline, is where you try to remove as many of the variables as possible and focus precisely or only on precision, right? The minute you say, well, now let's shoot off a barricade, or shoot off, well, that is introducing too much noise to the precision of. So you can't really, if you go to I guess what I'm saying is, in PRS, you can take a bench rest rifle
Mm-hmm.
that, our average quarter MOA rifle in bench rest.
Sure.
And I don't think anybody, even the best PRS shooter, could get it to shoot quarter MOA off a barricade and off of the course of fires that they use.
I agree.
That's why we say, well, that's not a precision sport, because the focus is not precision. The focus is different. So that's why we kind of separate.
So I would clarify that difference in hearing what you just said, which I agree with. I would clarify that with precision being the sole focus. Everything else is removed if it doesn't support precision or anything tied to it. Whereas that world is a blend of precision and field shooting. It still has to involve precision. I don't think you can ignore the fact that everybody in that sport is looking for precision. It's just a different environment for it.
Correct.
However, it is still in pursuit of precision.
Yeah, it is required, but it is not the main focus. I guess
it's the sole focus.
It is not.
I would say it is a main focus, but not a sole focus. It's a main focus within the environmental constrictions that are defined by the discipline, which in PRS or NRL,
well, I think
the field aspect of it.
I think PRS and NRL and matches of the like, they focus on accuracy
and precision. I mean, if you're void of either one of those, you're not going to perform well.
Well, I mean, you can have a 2 MOA gun. As long as
but it's not going to perform as well as a 1 MOA gun or a half MOA gun at the same level of accuracy.
And this is where we differ, because it depends who's shooting it. So if you have a 1 MOA gun, if you give me a quarter MOA gun and make me shoot it off a barricade, I'm not going to do well with it. Right.
But you will do worse with a 2 MOA gun off that barricade.
No, but what I'm getting at is, now you give a really good PRS shooter the 2 MOA gun, and they have a very high likelihood they're going to beat me. So that's why but
that's a skill level difference between the two shooters.
Well,
if you hold that as a constant, what I'm saying is true. Your skill level is static, right? All that changes is the dispersion capability of the gun I give you. So keep the same gun. Let's do 2 different loads. One load shoots 2 minute, one load shoots half minute. Your level of capability as a control in that example, you will perform better with the half minute system than you will the 2 minute.
Yes, and that is F class and bench rest. That's what we focus on.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely.
So that's my point. Like, for example, this might even clarify it even further. I think we both agree, but for example, what is your what makes you happy in a gun? Like, when you have a load that shoots X, I'm happy. What is X?
It depends. Obviously, as good as you can get it, right? I mean, everybody would be happy with a gun that had no dispersion at all. However, that doesn't exist. There's always some level of dispersion to varying degrees, right? In your world, the F class or the bench rest world, generally that's substantially smaller than it is in the PRS or NRL world. I think you would agree with that point.
That's precisely what I was saying. Like, because we focus, that's why we have, our groups are on average way smaller than PRS, because it is not as much a focus as it is in F class. I guess that's kind of what I was getting at.
Yeah, there's additional variables forced upon you within the discipline that cause a difference in observed precision, for sure. I would agree with that.
Okay. So again, back to what I was saying is, so that's why you mean it. Well, they're not precision shooters. Like, now that we kind of spoke about the differences in how it is perceived, and I said, well, okay, yeah, they're not precision shooters, meaning bench rest or F class or any other sport that small groups is what matters, right? Mm-hmm. Again, back to PRS, 10 hits on the target. You don't get extra points if all your 10 hits are perfectly centered.
Agree.
Versus scatter all over the plate. 10 hits is 10 hits. So that's kind of, so that was the things. Like, well, these guys aren't even precision shooters. Like, they don't understand. And I said, well, I don't know. Let me reach out and we'll have a conversation, because the thing that I like to do is start where do we agree, and then let's expand from there. So
okay, sounds good.
So large sampling, I agree, is better than small sampling.
Okay.
However, I believe that experience has a lot to do with whether or how much it matters. For example, if I'm starting out with if you hand me a brand new cartridge with a brand new everything and this powder that is unknown to me, it's going to require for me to do large sampling for me to start trusting it, right? For me to decide, yes, this is a good load. If you give me a second barrel and everything the same except for it's just simply a different barrel. Well, now I don't need to explore everything. I'm just going to.
You've proven that those components are worthy of a level of precision that you're looking for.
Right. So I'm not gonna. For example, if 50 grains of X powder with Y bullet have proven over the last 10 barrels to be just a killer combination, right? And because I have a new barrel and I'm shooting 49 grains, 49 and a half, 50, 50 and a half, 51. And again, 50 to 50 and a half, it shoots tight for 5 shots. That small sample is not the same as a small sample when I had no knowledge of anything.
Oh, certainly. Absolutely agree.
Right. So I guess that's where we're going with this, because we can have, it takes us not that long, not that many shots to arrive at a really good load, because I guess it's not 5-shot samples. It's 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 of experience, right? It's not the same barrel, but it's what we know it's going to work. Right?
Yeah, you've proven that those components are going to work. And we did mention that in those podcasts where we said, look, if you have good components, good bullets, good powder, things that have proven themselves, they've been used by the most high achieving people in the discipline, they have a reputation for good performance. If you combine those good components, you're likely going to get a good result. There's no argument there.
Right, but then again, there's no need for large sampling, in our opinion. Again, that's where I believe the discussion starts. Now that we agreed on all that, I think this is finally where the discussion starts. So
good.
Okay. So at that point, is 5-shot group still as meaningless as the previous 5 shots when I had no knowledge of anything?
The validity of a 5-shot group is independent of what you're looking for. I mean, the variability that exists in a sample of 5 that's a universal. That doesn't matter what you're looking for. However, I think what you're asking is if some of that data that we talked about in that podcast, we said that a 5-shot group is going to vary in size by 40 to 50%. And the examples we used there was a really good shooting system and a not good shooting system. So I think what you're saying is, let's say I get all these new components that I've never had experience with before, and they shoot a 5-shot group that's 1 inch. Well, if I continue to repeat that 5-shot group with that system, I'm going to have groups as low as 0.3 inches and as high as 1.7 inches. That's the variation in a 5 sample of 5. If I just continue to repeat it, which is what we did. This was an unbiased test. We just repeated it over and over and over and said, how repeatable is it? Now, if you take those good components that you talked about, ones that have proven themselves through those 1,000 rounds through that last barrel, these things have proven themselves to be good components, and all I did is get a new barrel and I have those same components. Let's say that system shoots really good. It shoots an average of a half minute, just to throw a number out. Then your 5-shot group results are going to vary between 0.15 and 0.85. That's a much tighter window. And that's because of the baseline system shoots better. The variance is the same. You're still dealing with the 40 to 50% variation in size of the sample result. But because it's smaller, you don't perceive it as that big of a difference. When you take a rifle out and it shoots a group that's 0.3 inches and then 1 inch and then 1.7 inch, you're like, what's going on? You can see that you thought when you got the 0.3 inch result, you think this is really good. And you just do that same test one more time. You shoot one more 5-shot group and now it's 1 inch. That's substantially worse. You say, I'm going to do it one more time, and you do it again, and it's 1.7 inches. That's substantially worse. That's a different story than when your gun shoots really small. The variability is the same. You shoot a half-inch group, and you're like, okay, I'm going to shoot one more. And then you shoot a 0.15 inch group. You're like, this is great. And then you shoot a 0.85 inch group. That's not as good, but it's not as concerning from a perception standpoint as a shooter as that other system. However, the variability is static, and both of those are identical.
I guess that's where things go haywire for us. If we have a gun that shoots quarter MOA on average,
okay, for how many shots?
Well, that's where I'm going with this, right? So we shoot testing, and it's like, well, it's 5 shots, and this thing keeps shooting, quarter MOA, and then the next time I go out, it shoots, 0.3, right? And then the next time I go out, oh man, it shot 0.2 this time, and then you go out again, and now it shoots. What would be the upper end on that, on the quarter?
So a quarter-minute gun for 5 shotters. For the low end, you're going to be down in the teens, the single digits.
No, the other way.
The high side would be 0.3, 0.4, somewhere in there.
0.4. Okay, so that's what we expect. But if we have a gun that shoots half MOA, and then the next time it shoots 1.5 or whatever the upper end of that is,
a half MOA on 5 shotters, the upper end is going to be about an inch, just inside of an inch.
So if it shoots an inch, it's like, well, we're breaking everything down. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And we just refuse to accept that as being statistics, and we're like, something's wrong. And because I don't know. I can't say, well, that's within the noise. No, I'm still going to lose championships. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's unacceptable for what you're looking for. So Correct. At that point, abandon it. Yeah, no issue with that. I agree.
Right. So for example, like this weekend, I have this rifle that I've been working on. This is fairly new to me. It's a 6.5 PRC necked up to 7mm. Okay. And I've been trying different things, but I went out and in testing, it was shooting consistently about 3 inches at 1,000 yards. Okay. 3 inches, 3.5, 2.5. And then I did a 10-shot group, and it hit, it was 5.02 inches or something like that. So let's call it 5 inches, right?
Okay.
For 10 shots. And then I go shoot a 20-shot group, and it did even better. For 20 shots, 18 of the shots, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, were about 4 inches, and 2 opened it up to about 8 inches.
Okay.
Those 2 we're not okay with.
But are they real or not?
What do you mean they're real? No, they are. I shot that this weekend.
Okay. Yeah.
So for me, I'm not saying, well, that's within the statistic. No, I'm calling everybody, going, hey, I called Jack Neary. Said, Jack, look at this target. What's going on? And none of the competitive shooters. Before I say that, if I had called you, what would you have said?
So that's outside of that's too big for what you want to deal with, right? You want to improve it.
No, statistically, what would you have said? Oh, that's part of it.
That makes, I would say the progression that you just told me, going from those first couple groups that were like 3, 3.5, 2, somewhere in there. I'm assuming those are like 3 or 5 shot groups. 5 shots. And then when I did a 10 shot was 5 inches. And then when you went to 10, you increased your sample size. The group size got bigger. Right. You went up to 5 inches. Then when you increased that, you went to a 20 shotter. The group size increased up to 8 inches. I would say that information is consistent with what we've measured in our testing here. Right. As you go up in group size, your chances of catching the outliers that are possible just through the normal distribution is higher, and you caught it there.
Yeah. So that's what I'm saying.
So what I would have told, so if you called me, you said, what should I do? I would say, do we know what caused those 2 shots to go outside of the rest of the 18? Do we know? Like, I'm saying no as like a very strong term, not just like, do you have an inkling of what it might be? Do we know for a fact what caused it? If we do, go fix that. If we don't, we have to be careful about fixing an unassociated problem that we feel is the right thing. because it may not be. There's a difference between knowing and assuming. And that's an important distinguishment to keep in mind as you problem solve that.
Right. So I guess for us, it's if they were 8 inches scattered all over evenly in a round group, that's just what it is.
Yeah.
But because 18 or all of them except 2 were up high, we're like, something's wrong.
Something's
here.
weird, right? Yeah.
Right.
Those ones are acting different. What I would recommend is do it again. If it happens again, repeats itself again, something similar to that, right? You kind of have a grouping that's nice and round and looks normal and it's good and tight to your expectations, but then there's these 2 that are just completely out. They act completely differently.
The flyers.
Yeah, the flyers. If it repeats itself on a flyer, then there's probably a cause for it that we can go figure out and fix. But if you repeated that same test one more time and that didn't happen, it's likely the noise. That's the normal distribution in the system. You just happen to catch 2 of the outliers.
Okay, that's perfect. I mean, that's I figured we would align because from again listening to the first when I heard your podcast, it sounded like it is what it is. You know, large sample. If it doesn't matter if it's 30 inches, that's what it is. But
no, not necessarily.
Right,
I mean,
and this is why I figured there was a disconnect in what you guys were saying and what I was hearing.
Yeah.
So. Perfect. So that's what I did. Which is another controversial topic. So this is going to be a perfect segue. So I was like, something's wrong. So I went and started checking my ammunition, my seating depth. And I had some that varied by 5 thousandths. And I fixed that. And then I shot the next day, which we shot over 100 rounds for score. And not a single one went outside. You know, I had no more flyers.
Those 2 were gone.
They were gone. It's not that those 2 were gone. The groups got bigger.
Okay.
But it was really windy. One day was dead calm. The other day it was really windy. So obviously as the wind increases, right, you have your what do you call it? Aerodynamic jump.
That's correct.
The wind switches from the right to the left. Well, that's going to make your group automatically taller because pushing it up or pushing it down. So, but the main thing was those random flyers were eliminated.
Cool.
So
you must have found the source of them.
Especially when I shot over 100 rounds and no wild shots. However, that brings me to seating depth, which you guys also said doesn't matter.
No, we said in the test data that we tested, it doesn't matter. We said that there is likely circumstances out there, combinations of bullets, barrels, propellants, cases, where it does matter. In the testing we did, however, it didn't. That's important clarification.
That is precisely the clarification that I wanted you to do. Okay. Because there's many people that have heard that podcast. And, you know, I had a small clip of Jack Neary explaining how he tunes his rifles. And he says, I change by 2 thousandths my seating depth, and I shoot 2-shot groups. I wait. He goes, I don't even wait for the wind to be dead. I just want consistent wind, and I shoot them as fast as I can because I also want to see how the rifle is shooting. He said, I shoot 2-shot groups. I change my seating depth for 2 thousandths. I shoot 2 more. He goes, and then that tells me how good of a barrel I have and how good of everything's working.
Okay.
Well, and that's where in the comment section, people were saying, well, that is meaningless. 2-shot samples are stupid, and it's already been proving that seating depth doesn't matter. And I'm like, that is not what they said.
Right.
So this is why I wanted to have this discussion, because people they hear things like that, and they go, oh, this is the new fact that applies to everything. And same thing that Brian Litt said when I had him on. He says it applied to our barrels, with our bullets, with our loads, that's where it applied.
Sure.
It is true in that.
Yeah. And I unfortunately can't control what people hear. However, what we said was that in our testing, it didn't make a difference, and that we can believe that it can in some circumstances. I mean, we're being forthright. I mean, we did not see that in our testing. That's a black and white, right? You either did or you didn't see it in the testing we did. We talked about the testing we did. We didn't see it. We followed that statement up with, can we believe a circumstance where you would see it? Most certainly. Absolutely. There's too many variables out there to state that. I mean, that goes against the whole point of the podcast, right? To say that our small little test that we did, which was over thousands of rounds, but in comparison to the probably millions of rounds that are fired in varying degrees of precision disciplines out there over the years, that this test we did as a small sample size in comparison to that. So it's not all encompassing. We're just telling you we did this test. This is what we learned.
Yeah.
It's up to you to interpret what's right for you.
Perfect. Absolutely. And this is where, this is precisely why I wanted to talk to you, because I knew you're a smart guy, and I'm like, there's no way they're gonna say this is the end all. Never.
Yeah.
Move
I
your
mean,
sitting
you
depth
listened
ever
to the
again.
podcast.
Yeah.
Did you hear us
Multiple
say that?
times? Well, I could see where people could hear that,
Okay.
because it wasn't you that said it. It was Miles.
Mm-hmm.
He said, I don't even mess with sitting depth anymore. According to our testing, doesn't matter. So I just
and that's what Miles does.
Okay.
Doesn't mean that's what everybody should do. Right.
Thank you.
We also mentioned in the clarification podcast that the systems that we did those tests within were with modern, chamber designs, such as the 6.5 Creedmoor and the 6-arc, which do a very good job of controlling the amount of tilt that a bullet can get before it engraves into the rifling. So the clearance around the bullet as it leaves the case neck and enters into the rifling has it's one of the contributing aspects of dispersion, of why a bullet doesn't go in the same spot every single time, right? You have that dispersion cone. So that said, we did testing with cartridges where that was not as much of a factor as some cartridges that are out there. If you look at some of the chamber tolerances that are out there, say with some of the SAMI cartridges, you can see where some cartridges have quite a bit of clearance over the bullet in the throat and some don't. Now, I can believe theoretically that those chamber designs that have quite a bit of clearance of the throat over the bullet are probably more jump sensitive. Totally believable. But that was not a part of our initial test data. Will that be in the future? Absolutely. But we didn't discuss that there because we didn't have the data tested.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I mean, it's all, you said it best when you said your results or your testing, it's in reality itself a small sample of what's really going on in the big picture. But it's you got to start somewhere. It was good information for sure. We have, in F class for us, doesn't matter. What really matters is those 20 shots that we put on target. How does it shoot for 20 shots? And yeah, sometimes the 20 shots don't do as good as the 5-shot, but that's usually how we get there.
Almost never. I mean, the 20-shotters are almost always a little bit bigger than your 5-shotters are.
Almost. I like that you said almost, because I've seen some 20.
It can happen the other way. It certainly
well,
can.
the record at 1,000 yards is 22. It's a 200 with 22 X's. That means 22 shots, consecutive shots in half MOA at 1,000 yards.
But that's a record. That's happened once.
Right? Yeah, absolutely.
Compared to how many times does it not happen? Oh, yeah, I'm not saying it can't happen.
Well, that's why I say you said almost, which it is correct.
Yes.
Now, that brings me to another thing about your statistics thing. Mm-hmm. That's how ignorant I am. I call it a thing.
You're fine.
For example, like, okay, so you say, in statistics, you can have a good gun that sometimes shoots really big. Not really big, but on the upper end, right? That for most it would be perceived as shooting really bad. Mm-hmm. The opposite is also true, right? Mm-hmm. Shoot something really tight. Why is it that when records happen, even though you have the exact same gun, same everything, they happen just once? Typically, it's hard for the same shooter to, with the exact same gun, exact everything, break or even tie their own record.
That question proves the entire point of that podcast that we tried to make was that when we're doing the sample size variability, so if I pull those numbers up just so we can talk about them, let's say that our discipline is 5-shot groups. The variability is 40 to 50%. In F class, when you're shooting your 20-shot groups, the variability is 20 to 25%. So you shoot your 20-shot groups are a lot more similar than the guy that's just shooting 5-shot groups. He's going to see more variation by nature of that sample size that he's using. So why does the guy that breaks the record not continually shoot that group size every single time? That's because the variability in his system exists. When he broke that record, he happened to get the small size of the variability that exists, and he happened to center it up on the target well. And those two things in combination, his accuracy was good. And he got the good end of his precision variance that's capable, right? Those two things added up. What does that mean? He got a very high score and he set the record. When he goes back and tries to do it again, he may shoot the exact same group size again, but his accuracy is off a little bit and he doesn't score as high, doesn't set a record. He may have perfect accuracy on the third one he tries. He gets that accuracy issue corrected from the second time he tried it into the third one. Accuracy issue is corrected. That thing's perfectly aligned with the center of the target, but he caught the level of precision that's on the upper end of what's capable. That variability that we talked about in precision in that podcast is exactly the root of your question there. And if it was untrue, that variability in sample size was untrue, if it was the same every single time, then the guy that broke the record would continually break that record. And we have proof of that in every discipline that that's not the case. Sometimes that guy can break a couple records. I'm not saying that a guy, once he breaks a record, can never break it again. The level of capability of the shooter and his components that he has, by his experience, to your point, learned to use to give him the best performance. All those things have a play in this conversation. However, you cannot ignore that variability exists, because that guy that broke that record can take that exact same system, same barrel, same components, same thing. And when he tries to do it again, it doesn't happen. That in itself is proof in the pudding of what we were talking about in that podcast.
Perfect. Makes sense. And again, it was just one of those things that it all matters how you listen or what you're hearing, right? Not everybody hears the exact same thing, which is the beauty about these podcasts, this long format videos, because we get to not only say something, but you can come back and clarify it. And then we can do like you and I are doing, where I'm coming in from a completely different point of view and challenge what you said.
Yeah.
Then you explain it and I go, okay, got it.
Yeah. Usually you have to explain something, multiple different ways to be able to get everybody or a large sampling of people to understand it. Just one method of putting words together and getting somebody to understand something is not going to be a blanket efficacy. You're going to have to change the way you say it.
So back to Jack Neer and his two-shot groups.
Mm-hmm.
Based on his experience and his, system and everything, they do have more validity than anybody else. Let's just say a hunter shooting a two-shot group. Am I correct?
I would think so, because Jack is doing the same thing every time. Generally, right? He's shooting the same discipline. He's probably shooting the same bullet and cartridge and propellant. Probably the same barrel. He's just making these small little adjustments in the overall grander picture. He's kind of doing the same thing. He's just making small little iterations to see what happens. So at face value, hearing 2 shots is valid enough to make a change makes me very nervous. However, if Jack has done this over and over and over and over, and the results are repeatable, I do this happens, I do this happens. If he's done enough of those cycles of that iteration, and it does that every single time, when I push this button, this thing happens, then sure, he's measured that. The repeatability is the key there. And where people get caught, though, is that they make one change once and it does something, and they think that's now a universal. That's not necessarily true. If you do that one thing and then you repeat that back and forth, trying to prove yourself wrong All too often we try to prove ourselves right. We have this hypothesis. I think this is the problem, so this is what I'm going to do to fix it, and then I'm going to test if it fixed it. And if in the test it supports that it fixed it, most people just, okay, that's it. It fixed it, right? What you should be doing, and in the scientific world you see it, those scientists that are good try to prove themselves wrong. Well, how do you prove yourself wrong? If I have a hypothesis that this does this, and I do it, and I test the result, and it shows that it did that, the only way I can prove myself wrong is to do it again and see if it ever doesn't happen. If it happens every single time I do that, there's no argument that that works. But all too often, we're not doing that. And I think that's the entrance of the ego that we addressed early in that conversation on that podcast, is unfortunately, when it comes to especially the precision shooting world, ego is a part of it, right? You're trying to perform, it's a competitive nature. You're trying to perform better than somebody else. And so having the emotional intelligence to check your ego when necessary and separate yourself from the scientific endeavor that you're trying to go down, that's an important distinguishment. And when those two get blended and they're not separated, that's when you can run into problems. That's when you get in that confirmation bias funnel that Miles was talking about. Oh, well, I got a good result here, and then I changed this and got a good result here, and changed this and got a good result here. You never went back and retested those to try to prove yourself wrong and see, were they actually good results every time, or did you just by chance happen to change something and got a good result? And if you go back and try to prove yourself wrong, you find out it doesn't do that every time. Maybe it does it less than 50% of the time. Then that's not a good way to affect it. It doesn't work. Does that make sense?
It does, but the whole ego thing is, I get what you're saying, but that is precisely the thing that keeps me testing more than the others, and
Sure.
shooting more, and shooting actually larger samples, because I
Right.
want to win. So I don't know that, maybe to some people, I don't think as much ego as much it is inexperience.
Could be,
Because
absolutely.
the
They
people
could
that
look
have,
very similar.
we all have big egos, right? The world champions and the hunters. However, I think the difference is in the world champion is they actually, because they have big egos, they go and put in extra work, and they test and change and test, because they want to bring the absolute best boomstick to the fight.
Agree. They have a healthy amount of ego.
Yeah, so I don't know that ego is what keeps you from believing it. If I think ego is really, at least for me, is what actually allowed me to prove to myself that this is a good gun versus not a good one, right?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
So I guess it's all in how you use it, like anything else. You can use it to your benefit or against you.
I think a lot of the folks that listened to the first 5 minutes of the podcast and then turned it off and said these guys don't know anything, I think that is an ego driven response, because Eric, you and I don't know each other on a personal level. This is the first time I've ever interacted with you, but you said it yourself. I'm probably not stupid, right? I mean, I've held a professional capacity in the small arms industry, where my job, how I feed my family, is to do things right. And many of the products we make here at Hornady are precision products. And so if I didn't do those things right, and we marketed a precision product and it wasn't precision, that's going to reflect on me because I did the work. So I can't be stupid and still be where I am today. That's no indication of my level of intelligence by any means. I got plenty to learn and I make mistakes all the time. However, for somebody to listen to somebody for 5 minutes on a very complex topic that took an hour and a half to go through, for them to dismiss it within the first 5 minutes and say these people are stupid and I have no room for anything they have to say, that's the ego I'm talking about.
Okay, fair enough. But that is another thing about social media, which is kind of what the example that I gave you. So on that clip that Jack was talking about, two-shot testing, he talks about, I think his name is Wayne Campbell. He was testing, and a friend of Jack's was over at Mr. Campbell's house, and he called Jack and said, "Near, we're in trouble. Campbell just shot his new barrel over 6 or 8 different seating depths, and he did his two-shot testing, and they were all one hole. And then Mr. Campbell went on to win I think Jack Neer said the 2, 3, and 4 gun national championships.
Very cool.
Having heard that, if I asked you, what do you think those 2 shots had any meaning, knowing that what the outcome was, he took that and he won the nationals. So obviously these guys absolutely have a system that works, and that's all they need to tell them what they need to know, right? But still, that's where this comment popped up of like, well, somebody made a comment that said, I wish one day we could understand what makes such good shooting rifles, the components and how the barrel was made and all that we can all duplicate it.
Me too.
And the very next comment said, well, what I really wish is that we would understand the importance of large sampling, and that was pretty meaningless. To which I replied, did you miss the part where he won the nationals?
Right. And the question there would be, did that level of performance that he won the nationals with come from those bullet jump adjustments, or was it something else?
Well, they weed out barrels that I think the conversation is figuring out about what a good barrel is, and they apparently do
barrels are different.
Yeah, they do this test, and that's how they can tell a really good barrel from a mediocre barrel or a
they do that jump
barrel.
Test. Yeah. Well, to me, what that jump test would say is that it tells you the sensitivity of that barrel bullet combination to jump. Well, if your amount of jump is going to change on you throughout the life of the barrel due to throat erosion or whatever it may be, I would want to pick a barrel that had the least jump sensitivity, meaning as I deliberately changed the jump, the result never changed. That means I have a system that's stable across something I can't necessarily control the rate of, which is throat erosion.
Right.
If that's a concern. So I would 100% agree with the method of it. However, the 2-shot sample could lead you astray in that circumstance. You could get 2 shots that were very close together, not necessarily because of that level of jump that it had, but because of all the other things that go into it. Because the sum of all of the variables that make a bullet goes where it goes is not one variable. That one variable has a part to play in it, and it may have a large percentage part to play in it. You don't know until you try it. But there's so many variables that go into why a bullet goes where it goes, that changing one of them in a very small way and testing that with a small sample size could lead you astray. I'm not saying it will, it could.
I agree with that. But I look at it, because I do similar tests, not with seating depth, but I do small sampling testing. But I'm not looking at 2 shots. I'm looking at the entire, he shot however many shots, 14, 16 shots. I look at the entire thing and how they behave with each other, right? How are they trending?
Absolutely.
People think I'm looking at 2-shot groups. I'm not looking at 2-shot groups. I'm looking at a 12 or 16 or however many, and then I look at the trend, and then you can typically pick out the one that doesn't belong. And you know what? That small, big, small. Let's test it again and see. But if
test it again.
If you have everything is, you shoot 6 groups in a row, and they are all one hole.
That's a good sign.
That's a very good sign.
Again,
that doesn't mean this is the end all, but it's a very good sign.
Absolutely. I agree with that.
So anyway, so I guess what I'm getting at is people hear you guys talk about large sampling and automatically starts dismissing everything else, regardless of who's doing it or why they're doing it. And that's where this comment. So I usually don't answer comments like that, but I decided to have some fun. And I said, well, and he said, well, I said, well, you're dismissing the part that he won the nationals, like 2, 3, and 4 gun. And he said, well, what would really impress me is if he could do that 50 times in a row.
True. True. I agree with that, right? I mean, if he did that 50 times in a row, think about how impressive that would be.
He'd probably win the nationals.
Yeah,
Well, he
for 50
did.
times in a row. How impressive. We just talked about
Yeah,
that guy that
but
wins
but
it once, right?
but
If
the
he did it 50 times, that'd be incredibly,
but the
incredibly
point, that's, obviously not the point of why they're doing the test, right? And it should not
right.
be dismissed simply because he didn't
Exactly.
do it 50 times in a row, right?
I agree. I agree.
And that's I guess everything's a spectrum, right?
Mhm.
Just when I listened to you, I listened and I rolled my eyes a few times the first go around.
Okay.
The second time around, I'm like, okay, I think I know what they're saying. They're not saying what I thought they were saying.
Okay.
The third time around, it was different. Every time I listened to it, and then when I knew you and I were going to have a conversation, that actually changed how I listened to it and what I heard. Seriously, because
Did it? In what way?
in a way that I knew I was at least going to get to ask, and I didn't immediately roll my eyes and go, you know what, I'm going to ask about this, instead of saying, because, right, if you never have the chance to get clarification, then that's
You
it.
have to make a judgment.
You have to make
right?
a judgment right there.
Mhm.
And since I knew you and I were going to be talking, I'm like, you know what? I don't need to make a judgment. I'm just going to make sure I ask about this.
Sure.
So it obviously changes what I heard and how I heard it, knowing that you and I were going to have a discussion.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And I am very glad that we're having this discussion, because I think a lot of clarifications have been made as to what you guys meant. The biggest one of which was, hey, this is true for our equipment and our lab with what we did. There's obviously can be, different results with different equipment, whatever, right?
Right.
And that is
And
probably the biggest clarification that we have made.
yeah, well, tell me if you agree with this. I mean, would you say that the culture at large, whether that's your specific culture, the F-class bench rest, just raw precision world, or other cultures of distance shooting that you've been involved in or are fringe to, would you say that it's common that people will do a test and they'll get a result and they'll think that that's it, like that's how good the system is, and it's gonna perform that way moving forward? Have you seen that?
Well, forget shooting sports. It's true, and you don't ever get a second opinion from a doctor that tells you you're absolutely healthy.
Sure. Great point. I like that analogy.
You go and they say, hey,
That
you're
was the
perfectly healthy.
purpose. That was
Thank
the
you.
purpose of our podcast.
Yeah.
Was, we all go to there's these couple different doctors that we all use, and that doctor is the load development, or that doctor is the 3-shot group or the 5-shot group, right? We all use that same doctor. Our question was, is that doctor missing something? And so we went to a whole bunch of different doctors. We went to the 10-shot doctor, the 20-shot, the 30-shot, the 50-shot, the 100-shot. There's another point of clarification. I think there were some people that thought like we were laying down and ripping off 100 rounds on a barrel and not accounting for barrel heat and throat erosion and fouling and all this stuff. I mean, again, we're not dumb. Like, we do this on a professional capacity. We did the testing with what the system could handle without inducing a bias to the test, right? And from the way we were doing it. So, but that's what we did. Is we said, what happens if we go to these other doctors? And what we found out was the diagnosis was different. We found out that, back to your example of that rifle that you used recently, when it shot those couple 5-shot groups at 1,000 and they were all around 3 inches, and then we went to 10 and it went to 5 inches, and then we went to the 20 and it went to 8 inches. That tells us a different story. Let's say you couldn't fix that and you didn't have time to correct it and you had to shoot a competition. You now know that 8 inches is possible. If you never would have furthered down that sample size road and you just stuck with your 3-inch 5-shot groups at 1,000, you're expecting that to continue. So what happens when you show up at the competition, you shoot your 20, which you're required to in your discipline, and it's 8 inches. Your foundation has been pulled out from under you're expecting 3-inch groups to happen at this competition because that's what you did. And it produced 3-shot groups. That's your record of what happened. So you go and you shoot it and it produces an 8-incher. You think there's a problem somewhere. So you go trying to fix it. You might pick the wrong thing, the wrong knob to turn to fix it. That might just be normal. That was the whole point of that. Now, to your specific example, obviously you went back and you were able to get those to go away as you continued to do that testing, and they never showed up again. What we were trying to do was help the guy that ends up in that situation because he doesn't have all this knowledge or experience, like you were talking about in Neary's case. The guy that doesn't have that is at a disadvantage because all that comes at a cost. If you had to put a dollar figure on all the stuff you know now in your experience, I mean, throw out a number. How much has it cost you to learn what you have? Time, bullets, powder, barrels?
Way too much.
Way too much, right? So the cost of those lessons are high to you. When somebody comes into, regardless of the sport, and they're early into this game, they're only doing what information is available to them, right? And the information in popular shooting long range culture is the 3-shot or the 5-shot group to assess how good it is, and then go off and shoot your big sample sizes at the matches, which is what you're doing. You're shooting 20s, and in the field style matches, you're shooting 200. And when the result at that match does not reflect the test that you did, guys are lost. So our point in putting out that information was to try to help people, show them, if you can do the small sample size testing, there's nothing wrong with that. But understand, if you do, it might not really paint a picture of what's to come as you continue.
Now, let me ask you a question. Now I'm going to get on the side of the hunters or the people that don't shoot as much as we do, right? And they have this, factory rifle, factory ammunition. And every time they go out, it shoots about an inch.
Mm-hmm.
And, inch and a half, whatever. It's just, so they're calling it and that one time it shot like a .997. So now, they're calling that a sub MOA rifle. That's okay, right? But it's still a 1 MOA rifle, right? And now this is a large sample. It's just a trend. I wouldn't call it a sample. It's probably a trend that this rifle never shoots better than 1 MOA.
Okay.
And then they do something different. And that produces a sub half MOA group.
Okay.
Something that rifle has never, ever produced before. Let's say it was only a 3-shot group, which they have always done 3-shot groups.
Okay.
Is there some validity that whatever they did?
Probably. Yeah. I mean, we discussed that in the podcast, that if you had two groups, and one of them was a quarter minute or a half minute group, and the other one was a minute and a half, there's probably a difference there. Most likely, statistically, confidence interval wise, there's probably a difference there. If you want to prove it, do it again.
Right. Yeah. And this is where I think the small sample needs to be looked at, kind of, I guess, the way we look at it as competitive shooters. We don't look at that one group by itself. We look at how has this been performing? What's the history, right? Well, this has been a half MOA rifle, right? And all of a sudden we change seating depth, and all of a sudden I'm starting to see quarter MOA groups, something I've never seen before out of this barrel. Well, guess what? Even if it's only 5 shots.
But if it's repeatable, well, I honestly don't care about the sample size as long as it's repeatable.
Correct. So that's the thing, and that's kind of what we do, right? It's like, well, that, but again, the way the way it starts, because we can't do 20 or 30 shot groups for every single seating depth test or every single anything, right? So what we do is I guess we look at it like what I'm saying is, we know the history, and we know this rifle has never shot better than half MOA. Let's do a seating depth test. You change seating depth, and now you start seeing groups down in the quarter MOA, 2 or 3 or 4 in a row. And you're like, here we go.
Yeah.
Right?
If it's repeating itself, valid. Absolutely.
Perfect. So, because there's been this whole thing about, you probably heard it about tuners, not working and things of that nature. And I get emails and text and messages all the time from people that tell me, I was about to give up on this barrel. Never could get it to shoot under 1 MOA. I put a tuner on there, and all of a sudden I got half MOA groups.
Cool.
Now, is this going to ag quarter MOA, aggregate, average? Well, who knows? But the point is, he has never seen groups that small ever before. So obviously, whatever he did made a difference, right? Now, the whole repeatable thing is obviously something that is very important, because you have to rely on repeatability to do anything, especially in competition shooting.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
So, but I guess a small sample is where it all starts.
It all starts there. Our crux of the matter is when we do a small sample and we don't repeat it, and we use that one result as our capability moving forward. That's where the problems come from. You can do that. I lined that out. We were just talking about hunters. I lined that out in that podcast. Let's say, because we told people, do this test the way the system's going to be used. So in F class, doing a 20 shotter is what's going to happen in competition. So you'd probably do that to see what your capability is. You might start with smaller stuff to make your tweaks and see your trends. But when you test that rifle before you go to a competition, you don't base it off a 5-shot group. You shoot a 20 and see what it does, right? You just laid that out earlier.
Right.
Well, hunting's no different. It's just a different circumstance. And in that podcast, I laid out that my personal method for this, and it can vary by people, is that I don't see myself needing to shoot more than 3 shots in a hunting circumstance. If I do, I've really screwed something up. I haven't done my job in limiting myself to my capabilities properly. So what do I mean by 3 shots? There's going to be a cold bore shot because the rifle is going to be cold, right? It'll be fouled, but cold. Then if the animal doesn't go down immediately, I'm going to put another bullet in it. Shot number 2, shortly after the cold bore. And under a crazy circumstance where I need the third one, I'll put a third one in it. If I get to the point where I have to keep on shooting after that, I've messed up on my end. From a capability standpoint, I didn't do something right. Now, so how do I get a valid, statistically valid capability to tell myself what's going to happen when I go hunting? I do my 3 shots, and I do it the same way the rifle is going to be used. I take it out in the morning. I let it set outside on a cold fall day or winter day. Let it sit outside just like it's going to be when I'm hunting. And I lay down and I shoot 3 shots, a cold bore, 2 follow-ups. And then I leave the rifle there with the ammo because it's going to be in the gun when I'm hunting in that environment. I may do that over a matter of days because I might hunt over multiple days, right? But what I do is I take all those 3-shot groups and then I, like you were saying, I lump all of them together. And if I do that 7 times because that gets me to a sample size of 21. I don't have to lay down and rip 21 rounds off in a row with my rifle to understand its capability. What I'm doing is simulating how I'm going to use it, but I'm repeating that simulation enough times that I encompass the high end and the low end of the variability. What I'm concerned with from a capability standpoint is the high end of the variability. I'm not concerned about the quarter-minute group. That right? I'm not going to miss because it shoots a quarter-minute group. What I'm going to miss by is the high end of that variability. So if my hunting rifle on the high end is a minute or a minute and a quarter, that tells me where I need to cut off my capability. Let's say the vital size of the animal is a minute and a half, just to throw a number out. And this gun on its worst grouping that I tested it with was a minute and a quarter. I'm approaching that limit. So as you go out time-wise, distance-wise, that's going to grow, right? Velocity variability, drag variability, wind variability is going to cause that group to get bigger as a function of time or distance. So there's going to become a point where that gun that's 1 1/4 on its worst day at 100 it's going to go past that minute and a half threshold, which is the vital size limit of the animal. That's where I cut my capability off at. The other side of that story, and the side of that story that's all too frequent in our world, is that I lay down and I shoot 1 or 2 3-shot groups and I get a quarter minute and 2 half-minute groups out of those 3 tests I did. My assumption is that on this thing's worst day, it's a half-minute gun. When I go out, that's going to stretch how far I can engage that animal at and make sure the bullet goes in the vitals. When in reality, if I continue doing that testing, I would have found a worst one. So I'm building my capabilities off of something that's not real. So I take that shot and the bullet happens to be, a minute and 3/4 out due to all those variables. I now had a result that wasn't supposed to happen based on the data I fed it. But what I fed it was small sample size, unrepeatable data. Does that make sense?
Yep, it sure does. So another thing you guys discussed is how, well, let me ask you. Oh, I've been listening to so many podcasts that now I don't know if you guys said it or somebody.
They're all intertwined. Huh?
At some point it happens. Let me just ask you, powder charge. How much does it matter in the, for example, because that's another test that we do, right? You have the optimum charge weight test, and then you have the ladder testing, and you have just multiple ways where we try to zero in on the best powder charge for our system. Mm-hmm. How much does that really matter in the whole scheme of things?
What we have seen is in the whole scheme of things, the powder charge can matter a lot. Small iterations of the powder charge don't seem to matter all that much. So what I mean by that is big jumps in powder charge, especially dropping the powder charge down, showed big benefits from a dispersion standpoint. I think all but one test case that we did, and let's clarify that with, I haven't tallied up the exact number, but I'm guessing we're somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 shots is what this data is made up of that we talked about on that podcast. Making big jumps, so let's say a half grain or a grain drops in charge weight, showed meaningful effects on dispersion. Dropping 0.1 or 0.2 grains didn't show anything. It was within the noise. So you would see something if you did a small sample size because of the variability that exists. If you repeat that small sample size over and over and over, same thing I did with my hunting rifle. I only want to shoot 3 shots, fine, no problem with that. But do that 3 shots over and over and over. What you find is that the variability is going to give you that window of your max and min, like I talked about earlier. Well, what we saw is as you dropped charge weight down, those maxes, mins, and averages all got smaller. The level of dispersion shrunk as we reduced charge weight. And that was across many different powders that are available to the commercial reloading market, as well as powders that are available only to manufacturers. That was the case in both.
This is one where it needs, as a competitive shooter, it needs a clarification. You said drop powder charge from where? Because people are going to listen to this and they may have a really low powder charge already and say, well, he said go down.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Let's clarify
so let's clarify that, because that could get dangerous.
Absolutely. So let's say you just look at, we didn't start at max, right? But we have pressure testing equipment, right? So we can immediately go find max.
Right.
The recommendation we put out to hand loaders or reloaders is pick an intermediate charge, work your way up if that's the direction you want to go, looking for signs of pressure and monitoring velocity at the same time. So let's just say you start at a max charge and then you start backing your way down. That's where you see the benefits come in. So definitely don't start at a min charge and start dropping charge rate. You can run into some issues by doing that.
When you say dispersion, is that you talk about group size?
The dispersion pattern, right? That's your cone of fire. Group size would be a measurement of dispersion.
Right. So what about standard deviation and velocities? Did you guys see any changes as you changed powder charge?
Not significant, more so by changes of the powder type.
Okay. So can you elaborate on that?
Sure. So monitoring the standard deviation, that's easy, right? Most of us can do that with the tools we have available, chronographs, labradars, magneto speeds, whatever. What we have seen is that the small sample size standard deviations bounce all around, just like the stuff I've been talking about this whole time. So if we look at statistically valid standard deviations, 20 plus shots that make up that standard deviation, what we see is as we drop charge rate with a given powder, it doesn't change all that much. Changing to a different powder would. So let's say the standard deviation at the max charge over 20 recorded shots is 10, and we drop it a grain, it might be 9, and we drop it a grain and it might be 11. Those aren't meaningful differences. What a meaningful difference would be is if it was 10 at max charge, we dropped it a grain and it went to 3, SD of 3 on 20 shots, and then we dropped it a grain and the SD went to 30. Those are pretty meaningful changes in the SD on a large sample size. What we've seen is changing the powder type has the biggest effect. So that one that had a SD of 10 at the max charge and then 9 dropped a grain and then 8 dropped a grain. If we change the powder, we might get an SD of 8 and then 7 and then 9. So there's a difference there between the two powders. And that data, we have an immense amount of data on, because as we manufacture ammunition, we're shooting it for pressure, velocity, and accuracy simultaneously. So I can't tell you how many hundreds of thousands of rounds have been used to analyze that information.
So you change the powder, and it that's the biggest thing that dictates whether your SD goes up or down.
Yes.
Right. So you're saying, let's back up right quick to where you were talking about group sizes by powder charge, and you said it only matters explain to me again, run it by me again. You said
Okay.
big steps versus small steps.
Yeah. So we don't expect to see, or we have not seen in any of the data that we've gathered, large changes in group size with small changes in powder charge.
Okay.
So the traditional methods of, say, a ladder or an OCW test, where you're gonna load a sample at 41.2 and then load a sample at 41.5 and then 41.7 on a large sample size of those three different samples of ammo, they don't change very much.
Okay.
Where I see the change happen is when I go from 41.5 to 40.5 to 39.5. Those big jumps, like a grain at a time, you will see changes in dispersion.
Okay. Okay.
We have.
Now I'm with you. I disagree. This is one of those where I 100% disagree with you until I had you explain it again, and now now I understand what you mean. Because what we do is we do small charges. I usually go for 0.3.
Okay.
However, I make sure I cover about 3 or 4 grains, so that
Pretty
I can
broad
see.
test.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's what you're saying, because I will see it. It's just going to take longer for me to see it, right? Because at some point, if you go in 0.3, you're going to end up at 0.9 and 1.2.
Yeah, every 3 tests is almost a grain. Yeah.
Right. So I just this is and because you don't know where you're at, right? Like if this is a sliding scale, you don't know where you're at in let's just say, according to your example, let's say 50, 51, and 52. You don't really see, you see it at 50 and a half and 51 and a half. I'm having a hard time explaining this. And that's why we do small increments to see where it starts to make a difference and where it stops making a difference.
You're seeing how wide your window is.
Correct. And that's why we do. But yeah, I guess what we're saying is you need to cover a large range.
Sure.
Whether you would do it in point half, wow, in 0.5 or 1 grain, you just need to cover a large enough range so that you can see, what makes a difference. Number one, if it does, and 2, where. And then at that point, you could, come back and do another test again, which that's the whole point of this large sampling, right? And then start testing in where it looked the best to see if it really is the best.
Keep repeating that the best. And you can also go to the worst one and repeat the worst one and see if it stays the worst. Okay. Most guys don't want to do that because the cost is too high for what they're wanting to learn, which is the best thing. But we've done that. Mm-hmm. We take the best one and the worst one and then just keep testing them. And we find out this one that was the worst one that time isn't always the worst one. Sometimes it's better than the best one was. As you continue to test and you start to encompass that variability. The problem that people run into is they do the test like you were talking about, where you change by small increments, but they only shoot like 3 or 5 shots at each one of those increments. And then they pick the best one out of that one set of testing. They say, well, this charge weight was best. And then they take that and run with it. Well, they never went back and tested the one that was the worst and kept testing both of those. And likely what you would see is they're not that much different.
Okay. So I guess what you're saying is, instead of doing, let's say I'm going to cover 3 grains of powder in 0.3 increments, that would be about 10 powder charges. That's 30 rounds. So you're saying instead of doing 10 charges at 3 rounds each, instead of doing that, we'd be better off going in 1 grain increments with 10 shots each.
Agree. 100% agree.
Okay. I'm gonna do that. Again, I do this mainly because I disagreed with you the first go around, but also because if I disagree, that means there's potentially something that that I could use.
Well, there's something that's not communicated.
Well, no, what I'm getting at is, if I disagree with you, that means you're doing something different than what I know. And there's always the potential that I'm wrong, and that whatever you have to offer is going to help me and my viewers just become better, more consistent shooters, which is at the end of the day what we're all after.
That's right. Yeah. And that was our goal with putting that information out,
The Jayden method. What are we going to call this reloading method?
Statistically valid method. It's not my method. That's the thing, is that this isn't a discovery made by us. This is just some data that we gathered and ran against these old rules.
That's how
it still holds true.
That's how all the reloading methods are. It's not new data. It's just they just attach a name to somebody did it, and that's it. Statistically valid reloading method is too long. We're gonna have to give it a cool name.
Make an acronym out of it.
Yeah, if it ain't cool, it ain't gonna get done.
Yeah.
Well, I had Quinlan Wojcik on the podcast. You know who Quinlan is?
I know Quinlan well, yes.
And he opened a big can of worms on this because I asked him, where do you true up when you true up your bullet drop? Do you change the velocity or BC? And it was in my head a very simple question, and that opened up.
Yeah, you opened a can then. Yeah,
massive can. Massive enough that he gave me about 5 to 10 minutes worth of kind of a window into what you guys have been working on.
Mm-hmm.
And it was large enough that we had to end it, and we agreed that he's going to come back. So I would like to, after I talk to Quinlan and he tries to explain some of this with anything, I'm sure I'm going to have more questions than answers.
Sure.
I would like to, after that, reach back out to you, and maybe we can have a discussion on that. But at this point, I have zero knowledge that I would not have a good enough understanding of what it is to be able to have a meaningful conversation with you. So
yeah, I'd love to do that. Yeah, get some kind of questions formatted and some experience in what the topic is, and then revisit it. That'd be great.
Let me learn about that some more. Do you know what he's talking about? The radar?
Oh yes, I do.
So I've been watching your ballistic, because you guys also did a few podcasts on that.
There's a couple of them there that would be really good to look at. So
I've been looking at
drag coefficient, ballistic coefficient ones.
I've been listening to them. I've been listening to them. So you know what? Do you have them on hand, or maybe your podcast people? So because you guys put numbers on them, just so that people that are listening, and even
Preston,
for myself,
know the numbers off the top of your head. He's looking them up real quick.
So that. Because I'm going and I start listening, and I'm like, I don't know if this is the one he was talking about, because but this is a radar derived drag curve. Is that what he's calling it? I think
that's one piece of it. Yeah, a lot of people focus on that piece. There's a lot more going on to it than that, but that is probably the piece that has a spotlight on it. Yeah.
Is this similar to what applied ballistic does, or is it different?
It's different.
Okay, because. Again, my ignorance really showed when I was talking to Brian, and I kept saying radar, and he goes, "Well, we use radar. It's the same thing." I'm like, "Well, I thought it was different." He goes, "Well, radar's radar," and I said, "Yeah, I didn't know any different."
The radar is just the tool that's measuring the velocity of the bullet versus time, and it's kind of simple in that analysis. But what you can do with that information is pretty incredible. But yeah, we'll get that list of podcasts.
If we can, do you have it now? We can name them on the air.
Preston? 28, 29, 31. 34 is the big one. Like if you do no others, do 34.
So it was 28, 29, 31.
31, 34.
Okay. And 34 is the big one. Okay. Yeah. I'm going to watch those. I don't think I've seen 34.
And then 44 as well, he said.
Oh, 44.
Yeah. I'll send you an email to your.
Yeah. But I want my viewers to also go watch those, because when this is stuff that, again, I one of the big benefits that I have is that I know I'm ignorant. And I don't have a problem. Man. I don't have a problem seeking out and such a small question in my head was a very simple question that I asked him, and he's like, "Oh no, it's not that
just
simple."
Ripped the can off,
and I'm like, "What?" So anyway, this is very interesting to me, just because it's something new, and I appreciate the work you guys are doing, and you got to come back so we can talk about that. But I got a lot more learning before we can have that discussion.
Well, thank you. And maybe to give you a little bit of, why I'm here and what I do at Hornady. I mean, we're in a position where we can learn a lot of things. We make a ton of bullets and we make a ton of ammunition. And one of my jobs and the team that I'm a part of is to test all that stuff and do research and development and all that kind of stuff. And I'm just as curious as you are. There's problems that I've suffered from when I was a kid growing up on the farm, learning how to shoot long range and knowing nothing, just hold higher and the bullet goes further was the extent of that knowledge. The amount of stuff that we've been able to learn here is really cool. So I appreciate your desire to continue learning that stuff. And I think we could help each other out there. I think we could help you maybe learn some of the lessons we've learned and things we've observed, which would be cool.
Perfect. All righty. I appreciate you being on. This has been a great discussion. I think it clarified a lot of things, and hopefully will push the sport forward into just getting more consistent and more championship winning rifles out there.
Absolutely. We all want to hit the target better. So that's the goal.
Exactly. Thank you. Take care, and
thanks.
Keep them centered.
Sounds good.
Bye-bye.